Inside a quiet diner, a waitress leaned in and whispered, "Sir, that police officer keeps watching me." He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive, just watching, waiting, using his badge like permission. The soldier could have looked away. He'd already lost enough. But some instincts never retire. When he stood up, the room changed, and what followed would cost him everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Spokane, winter. Snow pressed the city into silence. A roadside diner glowed against the cold, its windows fogged, its warmth fragile, as if one wrong look could shatter it. Michael Turner chose the booth with his back to the wall without thinking. He always did. Old habits didn't retire when soldiers did. They just learned to sit quietly and pretend to be furniture. The coffee in front of him had gone lukewarm, a thin skin forming on top like ice that hadn't decided whether to hold or break. At his feet, Bear lay still. Not asleep, never asleep in public, but resting in that disciplined way that looked like calm and felt like readiness. Michael didn't look down. He didn't need to. He could feel the dog's awareness like a low hum tuned to the room, to the doors, to the things that didn't belong. Michael tried to breathe normally. Crowded spaces always did this. Not panic, exactly. More like a tightening, a subtle shrinking of the world until it fit inside his ribs. The diner was small, harmless by any reasonable measure. Vinyl booths. A radio murmuring something about weather. The smell of coffee and fried onions. Normal people came to places like this to rest. Michael came to watch. He told himself he was here because it was warm, because Bear needed a break from the cold, because snow made his knees ache. All of that was true. None of it was the reason his shoulders hadn't lowered since he walked in. The reason sat 3 tables away. The man wore a police uniform, clean, proper. Badge catching the light whenever he shifted his cup. He had been there when Michael arrived and hadn't left since. Cup after cup of coffee, barely touched, his gaze never fully lifting, never fully resting, except when it settled on the waitress. Emily Carter moved between tables with the practiced rhythm of someone who learned long ago how to take up as little space as possible. She smiled when spoken to. She apologized when she didn't need to. She kept her eyes moving, as if stillness might invite something unwanted. Michael noticed the pattern before he allowed himself to name it. The officer's eyes followed her, not openly enough to draw attention, not clumsily enough to be obvious. It was the kind of looking Michael remembered from places that didn't make the news, the kind that counted steps, the kind that waited. Bear shifted, just slightly. Michael's jaw tightened. "You're seeing things," he told himself. "You always do." That was the curse of surviving. The world never felt neutral again. Every room was a map, every stranger a possibility. His therapist used to say hypervigilance was the mind's way of protecting itself. Michael thought it felt more like punishment. He forced himself to take a sip of coffee. Bitter. Too hot now, somehow. He swallowed it anyway. Then Emily turned, tray balanced against her hip, and their eyes met. It wasn't a long look. It wasn't dramatic. Just a flicker of recognition. Hers searching, his steady. In that instant, something inside her seemed to give way. She hesitated. Michael watched her argue with herself in real time. He recognized that fight, the instinct to speak versus the instinct to survive by silence. He'd lost that argument more times than he could count. Emily walked toward him. Each step looked measured, controlled, like she was afraid of being seen choosing him. When she reached the edge of his booth, she didn't sit. She didn't smile. She leaned in, close enough that only Michael could hear. "Sir," she said, voice low, careful. "I'm sorry to bother you." Michael didn't answer. He just nodded once. "There's a police officer sitting over there," Emily continued. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. He's been drinking coffee for over an hour. He keeps watching me, not like checking the room, like me. Michael felt something cold slide into place behind his eyes. He hasn't said anything wrong, she added quickly, as if defending herself against an accusation no one had made. But it doesn't feel right. I didn't know who else to tell. There it was, not fear, not hysteria, instinct. Michael had trusted instinct once, in a dust-colored street half a world away, and it had saved the man beside him. He'd ignored it another time, later, and spent years waking up to the sound of something exploding that wasn't there. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Emily blinked. She hadn't expected that. Most people wanted proof, details, a reason to doubt. Michael didn't. Bear's head lifted, slow and deliberate. The officer stood up, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to signal intent. He picked up his cup, took another pointless sip, and began walking toward the counter, toward Emily. Michael rose from the booth. His body moved before his thoughts caught up. He stepped into the aisle and stopped beside Emily, close enough that she could feel him there without him touching her. Bear came forward too, positioning himself at Michael's side, posture firm, eyes locked. The room shifted, not much, just a tightening, like a held breath. A few heads turned, someone laughed too loudly near the window. The officer slowed. His eyes flicked to Bear first, then up to Michael's face. For a moment, no one spoke. Michael met the officer's gaze and held it. He didn't glare. He didn't threaten. He simply refused to look away. "You don't own this space," his silence said. "Not today." The officer smiled, thin and practiced. "Everything okay here?" he asked. Michael didn't answer the question. "She's busy," Michael said evenly. "You can sit back down." The smile faltered. Just a fraction. The officer looked around, measuring the room, the witnesses, the variables. Michael saw the calculation happen. He'd made that same assessment under worse conditions. After a beat, the officer shrugged. "Just being friendly," he said. He turned and walked back to his table. The diner exhaled. Emily stood frozen for a second, then nodded to Michael, gratitude and something like shame tangled together in her eyes. She moved away, faster now, as if motion itself were safety. Michael sat back down slowly. His hands were shaking. He curled them around the coffee mug until the heat burned enough to anchor him. Bear leaned against his leg, solid, present. "You're not done," a familiar voice whispered in his head. "You never are." Michael stared out the window at the falling snow. Somewhere between the flakes, the past stirred. Desert heat, radio static. A moment when he should have spoken and didn't. He didn't know what would come of this. He didn't know if he'd made things better or worse. All he knew was that he hadn't turned away. And tonight, that would have to be enough. Morning arrived in Spokane with brittle cold, the kind that sharpened every sound. Snow lingered on sidewalks and rooftops, untouched, as if the city itself was holding its breath after the night before. Michael Turner woke before dawn, heart already racing, the way it often did when the dark loosened its grip. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him looked wrong, too flat, too clean, and his body reacted before his mind caught up. His pulse thudded hard in his ears, muscles tensing for a threat that wasn't there. It took longer than usual to remember the diner, the waitress's voice, the way the police officer's smile had cracked just slightly when Michael told him to sit back down. Bear lay beside the bed, awake, not moving, his presence steady and grounding. The dog's calm wasn't ignorance, it was vigilance without panic, something Michael had never fully relearned himself. Michael sat up slowly, waiting for the shaking to pass, telling himself it was just another morning, just another day, after a small, ordinary decision that should have ended the moment the officer walked away. He knew better. Experience had taught him that men who retreated quietly often did so to choose better ground. He took Bear out into the cold, the leash cold against his palm, the sky pale and unforgiving. Every passing car felt too loud. Every uniform, even from a distance, pulled at something raw in his chest. He told himself he was being paranoid, the same word Sarah liked to use when she was trying to sound patient instead of afraid. By mid-morning, Michael was back inside, cleaning a kitchen that didn't need cleaning, replaying the scene again and again, questioning every word he'd spoken, every inch he'd closed between Emily and the officer. He wasn't proud of what he'd done. Pride had nothing to do with it. He'd simply acted, the way he always did when someone smaller was boxed in by someone who believed power made them untouchable. The knock came just after 10. Sharp. Official. The kind that didn't belong to neighbors. Bear's head lifted instantly, body angling toward the door, not aggressive, just certain. Michael felt the drop in his stomach before he reached the handle. 2 officers stood outside, not the one from the diner, but close enough to be unmistakable. They were polite. That, more than anything, made him uneasy. They asked his name. They asked him to step outside. They said there had been a complaint. Michael didn't argue. He had learned long ago that explanations offered too early sounded like guilt. The cuffs were cold, biting into his wrists with a familiarity he hadn't expected to feel again in this life. One of the officers avoided his eyes. The other read from a small card the words "orderly and clean, disorderly conduct, assault on an officer." Michael almost laughed. The absurdity of it pressed against something fragile inside him. Assault. He pictured the distance he'd kept, the restraint he'd forced on himself, the way he'd chosen presence over force. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Bear whined once, low and confused, and Michael turned his head just enough to meet the dog's eyes. "It'll be okay," he tried to say without words, though he wasn't sure it was true. The ride to the station blurred past windows streaked with frost. Michael's thoughts fragmented, slipping between now and then, between the present cold and another heat, another street where authority had also been weaponized, where uniforms didn't always mean protection. He focused on breathing, on counting, on the pressure of the seat beneath him. At the station, the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Michael answered questions carefully, choosing silence when he sensed the ground shifting under his feet. No one mentioned Emily by name. No one mentioned the diner. The narrative had already been written, neat and damning. He was placed in a holding cell, the door closing with a final sound that echoed too loudly in his head. Time stretched. His hands trembled, not from fear exactly, but from the effort of holding himself together. This was the part that hurt most, not the accusation, but the familiarity of it, the sense of being reduced to a problem to be managed. He pressed his palms against the cool bench and waited, reminding himself that this wasn't the desert, that no one was shooting, that Bear was safe somewhere, that this would end. When Sarah arrived, it was hours later. He recognized her voice before he saw her, controlled and clipped, the way it got when she was trying to keep emotion from leaking into professionalism. She spoke to someone at the desk, her words precise, legal, efficient. When she finally stood in front of him, her eyes searched his face not for injury, but for confirmation of her worst fear. "You promised you'd stay out of trouble," she said quietly. Michael didn't answer right away. He watched the muscles in her jaw tighten, the way they used to when she was a teenager, listening to arguments through a bedroom door. "I didn't start anything," he said at last. Sarah exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "It doesn't matter," she replied. "It never does." She signed papers, she made calls, she paid without looking at the number. When Michael was released into the cold afternoon, the sky already dimming, Sarah was waiting by her car. The drive to his house was silent at first, Spokane sliding by in gray and white. Then the words came, brittle and fast. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" she asked. "Do you know how many times I've had to explain you to people who don't understand PTSD and don't want to?" Michael stared out the window, watching snow gather along the curb. He wanted to tell her about Emily's voice, about the fear that had been unmistakable, about the moment when doing nothing would have felt like betrayal. He wanted to tell her that some nights he still smelled burning metal in his sleep, that silence had cost him too much already. Instead, he said, "I couldn't walk away." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That's what Mom said," she replied, her voice dropping, "that you never could." The house was cold when they arrived, empty in the way it had been since his wife left years ago, unable to live with the constant vigilance, the sudden distance, the man who came back from the Middle East, carrying a war he refused to name. Sarah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking at him, not as a client or a defendant, but as a father she loved and resented in equal measure. "This can't happen again," she said. "They will make it happen again if you give them a reason." Michael nodded, though something inside him resisted the word reason. Later, alone, he sat on the edge of his bed while Bear rested close, the dog's trust unbroken, uncomplicated. Michael replayed the arrest, the careful way it had been constructed, the absence of the real threat in every report. He knew then that the officer from the diner hadn't retreated. He had planned. And somewhere, beyond Michael's walls, Emily Carter was still walking between tables, still being watched. As night fell, Michael's phone buzzed with an unknown number, then went silent, leaving behind a single, unanswered question that settled heavy in his chest. Evening settled over Spokane with slow, heavy snow, muting traffic and sound alike, turning the streets into pale corridors where memory felt louder than footsteps. Michael Turner sat at the small kitchen table long after Sarah had gone quiet, the house holding its breath the way it always did after raised voices finally ran out of air. The arrest still clung to him like a smell he couldn't wash off, not the metal of the cuffs, but the deeper humiliation of being handled, processed, reduced. He kept replaying it, not because he wanted to, but because his mind refused to let the moment stay in the past where it belonged. PTSD didn't arrive as explosions or screams anymore. It arrived as loops, as echoes, as the relentless sense that the world was a step away from tipping again. Bear lay nearby, alert but calm, the only living thing in the room that didn't seem to demand an explanation. Michael rested his hand on the floor, feeling the steady warmth there, grounding himself the way his therapist had once taught him, back when he still believed exercises could close wounds instead of just keeping them from bleeding out in public. Sarah finally spoke from the doorway, her voice measured now, exhausted rather than angry. "This isn't sustainable," she said. Michael didn't look up. He knew what she meant. She had been saying versions of it since she was old enough to name what was wrong with him, since she learned the word PTSD and began using it like a diagnosis and a shield at the same time. Michael thought of the years after he came back from the Middle East, the way sleep became an enemy, the way silence felt hostile, the way ordinary sounds turned into threats without warning. He remembered the night his wife stood in this same doorway, hands shaking, telling him she couldn't live like this anymore, not with the pacing, the locked doors, the sudden distance in his eyes when something pulled him somewhere else. She hadn't said she was leaving because of PTSD. She had said she was leaving because she couldn't reach him. The distinction had mattered then. It still did. Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against the wall, watching him the way she did in courtrooms when a witness was about to contradict themselves. "You scared me today," she said. "Not because you were arrested, but because you didn't seem surprised." Michael swallowed. That cut closer than she knew. He had been surprised once, years ago, the first time his body reacted before his thoughts could slow it down, the first time his family saw him flinch at nothing. Since then, surprise had been replaced by expectation. Trouble wasn't shocking anymore. It was familiar. He tried to explain this, stumbling over the words, aware of how inadequate they sounded even to his own ears. "I didn't go looking for it," he said. Sarah shook her head. "You never do. That's the problem." Her voice softened just slightly. "You step in, you take the hit, and then you act like it's the only way things could have gone." Michael looked up then, meeting her gaze. For a moment he saw not the lawyer, but the child who used to wait up for him, counting headlights through the window, needing proof he was still there. "If I hadn't stepped in," he said quietly, "someone else would have been hurt." Sarah hesitated. "Emily," she said. "You mean the waitress?" Michael nodded. Sarah exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "You don't know that," she replied. "You don't know what would have happened." Michael thought of Emily's voice, the way it had dropped when she leaned in, the careful control layered over fear. He thought of all the times someone had said nothing because they assumed someone else would. "I know enough," he said. The argument stalled there, not resolved, just suspended, another thing neither of them knew how to put down safely. Sarah eventually turned away, retreating into the spare room she used when staying over, leaving Michael alone with the house and his thoughts. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, and with it came the memories he worked so hard to keep compartmentalized, heat instead of cold, sand instead of snow. Orders barked through static. The moment he learned that hesitation could be fatal, that waiting for permission often meant waiting too long. He rubbed his hands together, grounding himself again, reminding his body where it was. Spokane. Winter. Home. Bear shifted closer, sensing the change before Michael fully registered it. The dog's presence was not a cure. Michael never pretended it was. But it was a reminder of something unbroken, something that trusted him without conditions or explanations. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, breathing, until the past loosened its grip. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Sarah moved, restless. Michael wondered what she would say to her colleagues if this case went further, how she would reconcile defending the law with defending her father. He wondered if his wife, wherever she was now, would see this as proof that leaving had been the right choice. The thought hurt more than he expected, even after all these years. He hadn't blamed her, not really. He had blamed himself, silently, thoroughly. When his phone vibrated again on the table, he opened his eyes at once. Another unknown number, another unanswered call. His pulse quickened, instinct overriding caution. He didn't answer. Not yet. He let it ring out, listening to the silence that followed, aware that something had shifted. The officer from the diner had made his move. Michael had survived it. But survival was never the end of the story. It was just the point where consequences began. Night returned to Spokane with heavier snow, the kind that erased edges and softened distance, turning streets and parking lots into uncertain spaces where sound traveled strangely and intentions hid easily. Michael Turner waited in the car longer than necessary, engine off, breath fogging the windshield in slow pulses. He told himself he was just watching the weather, measuring how quickly the snow accumulated, but he knew the truth. Waiting was a form of control, and control was the only antidote he had left when memories threatened to take the wheel. Bear sat beside him, not restless, not impatient, only attentive, as if the dog understood that this night mattered in a way the others hadn't. Michael checked the time, then checked it again, a habit that used to be tied to mission windows, and now attached itself to anything that felt like a countdown. Emily Carter's shift ended late on Thursdays. He had learned that without asking her, by noticing patterns, by reading the room the way he always had. The irony didn't escape him. He was doing the same thing he despised, except his watching was meant to prevent harm rather than cause it. That distinction mattered to him, even if it wouldn't matter to anyone reading a report later. He rubbed his hands together, feeling the cold bite through the fabric, grounding himself in sensation. Sarah's words from earlier in the day echoed in his head, the mix of fear and frustration that had colored every conversation since the arrest. This can't happen again. He didn't want it to. Wanting, however, had never been the deciding factor in his life. The diner's lights dimmed as closing time approached. A couple of employees slipped out the side door, laughing, unaware of the way the night held its breath. Michael straightened when he saw Emily step outside alone, shoulders hunched against the cold, keys already threaded between her fingers. He felt the familiar pull to intervene immediately, to step into the open and make his presence known, but he forced himself to wait. He watched instead, scanning the shadows, the parked cars, the way snow muted footsteps. Bear's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, attention narrowing toward the far end of the lot. Michael followed the dog's line of focus and saw him. The police officer stood near a patrol car, uniform immaculate, hands relaxed at his sides, as if he'd been there all along. The sight triggered something sharp and immediate in Michael's chest, not panic, but recognition. This was the ground the man had chosen. Emily slowed, her body registering danger before her mind could fully name it. The officer spoke, and though Michael couldn't hear the words, he recognized the cadence, the tone designed to sound calm, reasonable, authoritative. Michael opened the car door. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped out, the sound louder than he liked. The officer's head turned. For a moment there was nothing but distance between them, measured and deliberate. Michael moved closer, placing himself where Emily could see him without having to turn fully, close enough to matter, but far enough to avoid escalation. Bear took position at his side, not growling, not posturing, simply present in a way that altered the geometry of the space. The officer's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Michael. There was annoyance there now, stripped of the earlier pretense. "You again," the officer said, his voice carrying easily through the cold. Michael felt the urge to respond with something sharp, something final, but he held it back. Control, he reminded himself. Always control. "You should step away from her," Michael said, keeping his tone level. The officer smiled, a small, private thing. "I'm doing my job," he replied. Michael shook his head once. "No," he said. "You're abusing it." The words landed heavier than Michael expected. Naming the behavior out loud did something to the air, to the balance of power the officer had been relying on. Emily stood frozen, caught between fear and relief, and Michael wished he could tell her to leave, to go back inside, to not watch this unfold. But movement might make things worse. The officer's smile vanished. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he said. Michael met his gaze and didn't look away. "I do when you're using it to threaten someone who asked for help," Michael replied. His heart was pounding now, not with fear, but with the effort of staying present, of not letting the past rush in and replace the present moment with another one that had ended badly. He felt Bear press slightly against his leg, a steadying force, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this moment, that not every confrontation had to spiral into violence. The officer glanced around the lot, checking for witnesses, for cameras, for angles. Michael saw the calculation and felt a cold certainty settle in. This wasn't going to end here. The officer straightened, reclaiming his official posture. "You're interfering with a police interaction," he said, louder now, the words meant to carry, meant to sound legitimate if anyone overheard. Michael felt the trap closing, the same trap he'd sensed the morning after the diner. He could step back. He could disengage. He could protect himself. The thought came and went in an instant. Emily shifted, keys trembling in her hand, and Michael knew that stepping back would cost more than he was willing to pay. "She asked for help," he said. "That doesn't give you the right to intimidate her." The officer's eyes hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he replied. Michael almost laughed at that, the sheer audacity of it, the way authority so often mistook confidence for truth. He took a slow breath, forcing his body to stay anchored in the cold, in the snow, in the now. "I know enough," he said, "enough to see when power's being used to silence someone." The officer stared at him for a long second, then took a step back, as if conceding ground. Michael felt a flicker of hope he immediately distrusted. The officer raised his hands slightly, palms out, a performance of de-escalation. "Fine," he said. "Have it your way." He turned, walking toward his car, and Michael let himself believe, just for a moment, that the line he'd drawn would hold. Bear relaxed a fraction, tension easing without disappearing. Emily exhaled shakily. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched the officer reach the patrol car, watched him open the door, watched him pause. When the officer looked back, his expression was calm again, almost satisfied. "We'll talk again," he said, and the words weren't a threat so much as a promise. The patrol car pulled away, tires crunching through snow, red taillights disappearing into the night. Michael felt the aftermath hit him all at once, the delayed tremor of adrenaline, the weight of what he'd just done settling into his bones. He turned to Emily. "You should go home," he said, "and if he contacts you again, you call me." She nodded, eyes bright with something between gratitude and fear, then hurried toward her car. Michael stayed until she drove away, then returned to his own vehicle, hands shaking as he closed the door. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, breathing, counting, grounding. Bear leaned closer, a quiet reminder of loyalty without conditions. Michael knew then, with a clarity that cut through the noise in his head, that the officer had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The accusation, the arrest, the confrontation, all of it was part of a pattern that wasn't finished revealing itself. As he started the engine, his phone vibrated again, the same unknown number lighting the screen. This time, he answered, and the silence on the other end told him more than words ever could. Snow fell harder over Spokane, thick and relentless, swallowing light and sound, turning streets into narrow tunnels where choices felt heavier and every step forward erased the ground behind it. Michael Turner did not sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, counting seconds, waiting for the familiar surge of panic that came when his mind decided it was time to relive something it refused to let die. The call he had answered the night before still echoed in him, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Silence had always been a language he understood too well. In the Middle East, silence meant someone was moving. Here, it meant someone was planning. He got up before dawn, moving through the house without turning on lights, careful not to wake Sarah. Bear followed, close enough that Michael could feel the dog's presence even without looking. It struck him, not for the first time, how different their forms of vigilance were. Bear watched the world as it was. Michael watched it as it might become if he looked away. He made coffee he didn't drink, stood by the window, and let the cold seep through the glass until sensation anchored him. Sarah left early, avoiding eye contact, her silence sharper than the anger from the day before. Michael didn't stop her. He understood retreat when he saw it. By mid-morning, he was back in his car, parked far enough from the diner to look accidental, close enough to matter. He told himself this was about Emily, about making sure she got through another shift without being cornered or frightened into compliance. He didn't tell himself that the confrontation had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose that felt dangerously close to the clarity he used to have overseas. Purpose was a double-edged thing. It kept him steady, but it also pulled him toward trouble. Emily arrived, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the lot before she went inside. Michael watched the way she exhaled when she crossed the threshold, the way safety, however temporary, settled into her posture. He waited. Hours passed. Snow piled higher against the curb. The officer didn't appear. That absence was more unsettling than any open confrontation. Michael recognized the tactic. Pressure wasn't always applied by presence. Sometimes it was applied by waiting for someone to believe they were safe again. Late afternoon, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again. He let it ring out, pulse steadying rather than spiking this time. Control, he reminded himself. When the call stopped, a message appeared. Not text, not voice, just a missed call notification that felt deliberate. Michael leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes briefly. He wasn't imagining this. He knew that with a certainty that cut through the fog, PTSD often brought with it. This wasn't random. It was escalation. He left the car as evening approached, walking bare through the neighborhood instead of driving, forcing himself into motion that felt normal, visible. Every uniform they passed drew his attention, though none stopped. He wondered how many people saw badges and felt comfort where he felt caution. When night came, he returned home to find Sarah waiting at the kitchen table, her coat still on, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "I heard from a colleague today," she said without preamble. Michael stayed standing. "About you." He nodded once. The weight of it settled between them, unspoken but heavy. "They're saying the officer filed an additional report," she continued, "that you've been loitering near the diner, that you're harassing him." Michael felt a hollow open in his chest. Not surprise, but confirmation. "He's building a narrative," he said. Sarah's jaw tightened. "You're making it easy for him," she replied, frustration leaking through her careful tone. Michael wanted to argue, to explain that sometimes avoiding something made it worse, that predators counted on fear and compliance. He said none of that. He only said, "He's not going to stop." Sarah studied him for a long moment, searching for something she could either refute or rely on. "You don't know that," she said, though it sounded like she didn't fully believe it herself. Michael met her gaze. "I do." Silence stretched again, familiar and uncomfortable. Sarah finally looked away. "I can't keep pulling you out of situations like this," she said quietly. The words landed hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. Michael nodded. "I know." That night he made a decision he'd been circling all day. If the officer was going to accuse him of watching, then watching carefully, deliberately, would be the least reckless thing he could do. He began documenting everything, times, calls, locations, not as a soldier, but as a witness. He kept his distance, stayed where cameras were likely, where his presence could be explained if challenged. Bear sensed the shift in him, the move from reactive to methodical, and settled into it without question. This was familiar ground for both of them, not combat, but preparation. Near midnight, another call came. Michael answered this one. No one spoke. He listened to breathing on the other end, controlled, patient. Michael said nothing, refusing to offer what the caller wanted. After a few seconds, the line went dead. He set the phone down carefully, aware that his hands were steady now in a way they hadn't been in days. Fear was still there, but it had been organized, shaped into something usable. Somewhere across the city, a man in uniform believed he was tightening the noose. Michael knew instead that lines were being drawn on both sides. He didn't know who would make the next move, only that when it came, it would not be subtle. Winter tightened its grip on Spokane, the snow no longer gentle but compacted and sharp, reflecting streetlights in harsh glare, as if the city itself had decided to stop pretending anything here was soft. Michael Turner knew something was wrong before the sound reached him. It wasn't instinct alone, though instinct played its part. It was pattern recognition, the kind carved into him by years of surviving moments that began quietly and ended badly. He had just locked the front door when his phone vibrated again, the same unknown number, persistent, deliberate. He didn't answer immediately. He stood still, breathing, letting the present anchor him. Bear lifted his head, tension running through him like a held note. When Michael answered, Emily Carter's voice came through, thin and strained, stripped of the careful politeness she usually wore like armor. "He's here," she said. "He followed me." Michael didn't ask who. He didn't ask where. He asked one thing only. "Are you somewhere public?" There was a pause, then a shaky yes. parking lot, near the bus stop. Michael felt the familiar narrowing of the world, the way everything unnecessary fell away. "Stay where you are," he said. "Don't move toward him. I'm coming." He grabbed his jacket, keys already in hand, Bear at his side without command. The drive was fast, but controlled, every red light a test of restraint. His mind tried to drag him backward, to overlay this moment with others that ended in gunfire and screaming, but he pushed it away. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a city street. That distinction mattered. When he pulled into the lot, he saw them immediately. Emily stood near a lamppost, shoulders hunched, phone clenched in her hand. The officer stood too close, posture casual, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing as he spoke. Michael parked where the security camera was visible, a conscious choice, and stepped out slowly. Bear stayed close, not tense but alert, a quiet promise at Michael's side. The officer turned as Michael approached, irritation flickering across his face before settling into something colder. "You don't learn, do you?" the officer said. Michael ignored him, his focus on Emily. "Get behind me," he said calmly. She hesitated only a second before stepping back, relief and fear colliding in her eyes. The officer's voice sharpened. "Sir, you're interfering with police business." Michael felt the accusation slide into place, too familiar now to surprise him. There it is, he thought, the final shape of the trap. "What business?" Michael asked, keeping his tone even. "Following a woman after her shift?" The officer smiled, slow and confident. "You've been stalking me," he replied, "showing up everywhere I am, harassing an officer in the line of duty." Michael almost laughed at the inversion of it, the audacity of rewriting reality while standing in it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He stood exactly where he was, aware of the camera, the light, the witnesses just beyond the edge of the lot. "You contacted her repeatedly," Michael said. "You followed her from her workplace. That's harassment." The officer's eyes flicked briefly toward Emily, a warning disguised as indifference. "She's confused," he said. "Happens all the time." Michael felt something hot rise in his chest, anger sharp and dangerous, and he forced it down, channeling it into clarity instead of force. "She asked for help," he said, "and you used your badge to scare her into silence." The officer's jaw tightened. "That's enough," he said, reaching for his radio. Michael saw the moment for what it was, the pivot from intimidation to consequence. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, a mirror of compliance that was also a statement. "I'm not resisting anything," he said. "I'm documenting this." The officer hesitated, just long enough for Michael to know he'd hit something real. "Sir," the officer said louder now, projecting authority for the cameras, "for the night. Turn around." Michael didn't move yet. He looked at Emily, met her eyes. "You need to say what happened," he said quietly. "Not to me. To whoever comes next." Emily's lips trembled. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Michael replied, "but silence is what he's counting on." The officer grabbed Michael's arm, not hard enough to hurt, hard enough to assert control. That was the moment Bear reacted, stepping forward with a low sound that wasn't aggression so much as warning, a line drawn without crossing it. The officer recoiled instinctively, surprise flashing across his face. Michael seized the moment, not with force, but with his voice. "Do not touch me again," he said, every word precise. "Call your supervisor. Call internal affairs. Right now." For a second, Michael thought the officer might strike him, might make the mistake that would justify everything. Instead, the officer shoved him back, just enough to stagger, just enough to leave no doubt about intent. Michael went down on one knee, pain flaring briefly, contained. He stayed there, breathing, letting the camera catch it all. "Sir," the officer said into his radio, voice tight, "I have a subject resisting." The lie hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Within minutes, sirens approached, blue and red slicing through the snow. Michael stayed still as additional officers arrived, hands raised, posture non-threatening. He spoke only when addressed, choosing his words with care, offering facts instead of accusations. Emily spoke too, her voice shaking, but steady enough to be believed. When a supervisor arrived, older, slower, eyes sharper, Michael felt the balance shift. Questions were asked, stories compared. The officer's confidence began to crack, small inconsistencies surfacing under scrutiny. Michael watched it happen with a strange detachment, as if he were observing a mechanism finally grinding against itself. When the supervisor pulled the officer aside, lowering his voice, Michael felt something inside him loosen for the first time in days. Bear sat at his side, calm again, as if sensing the worst had passed. Michael didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted. He knew this wasn't over, not yet, but something essential had changed. The narrative was no longer controlled by one man with a badge and a grudge. As the officers finished taking statements, the corrupt officer was led away from the group, his face rigid, eyes burning with a promise of consequences still to come. Michael watched him go, aware that whatever happened next would ripple outward, touching Sarah, touching Emily, touching truths long buried under authority and fear. As the night settled back into uneasy quiet, Michael felt the weight of the choice he'd made fully land. He had stepped into the open knowing the cost. Now, there was no turning back. Spring edged into Spokane quietly, winter loosening its grip as snow thinned into slush and pale sunlight returned, tentative but real, like a promise the city wasn't sure it was allowed to keep. Michael Turner stood at the kitchen window and watched the light move across the street, noticing how the ordinary details felt sharper now that the pressure had eased, not gone, but relocated, as if the weight he carried had shifted from his chest to his shoulders where it could be borne. The investigation had concluded without ceremony, no speeches or apologies, just paperwork and outcomes that spoke louder than words ever had. The officer's badge was gone, the authority that had protected his behavior stripped down to a record that would follow him instead of the other way around. Emily Carter no longer checked the room every time she entered a space, and though Michael knew fear didn't disappear on command, he could see the difference in her, the way relief didn't rush her steps but steadied them. Michael himself felt changed in subtler ways. The nights were still uneven, sleep still a negotiation rather than a guarantee, but the constant sense of impending consequence had lifted. He no longer waited for his phone to buzz with accusation. He waited instead for the sound of Sarah's car in the driveway. When she arrived, it wasn't with legal documents or restrained frustration, but with groceries and an unfamiliar quiet that wasn't avoidance. She set the bags down, moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and finally sat across from him, hands folded, eyes searching his face without judgment. "I watched the footage again," she said, not accusing, not defensive. Michael nodded. He didn't need to ask which footage. "I didn't want to believe it at first," she continued, voice steady but careful. "It was easier to think you were provoking something than to accept that you were protecting someone and paying for it." Michael felt the words settle into him slowly, the way truth often did when it wasn't forced. He remembered all the times Sarah had been young and angry and confused, the years when his vigilance had looked like distance, when his silence had been mistaken for indifference. He remembered his wife standing in this same room, the way love had given way to exhaustion, the way she had chosen survival over waiting for a war to end, inside a man who didn't know how to lay his weapons down. "I didn't know how to be different back then," Michael said quietly. Sarah nodded. "I know," she replied, and the acknowledgement mattered more than forgiveness ever could have. She told him about the internal meetings she'd observed from the outside, the discomfort in rooms that preferred clean narratives, the way truth had forced itself forward anyway. She told him she had stopped referring to his actions as reckless when colleagues asked and started calling them what they were, necessary. Michael listened without interrupting, aware of how rare this moment was, the chance to be seen not as a problem to manage, but as a person whose choices carried moral weight even when they came at a cost. Bear lay nearby, content in the way that came from sensing resolution rather than understanding it, loyalty intact and uncomplicated. Michael realized then that his dog had never doubted him, not when the cuffs closed, not when the phone calls came, not when the world tried to convince him that silence would have been safer. That faith had steadied him more than any argument ever could. Sarah stood and moved closer, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder, a simple gesture that carried years of withheld trust. "You're not broken," she said, and Michael felt something inside him finally give, not collapse, but release. He hadn't needed absolution from the past. He had needed permission to believe that living with scars didn't disqualify him from doing good. They ate together without discussing the case again, the conversation drifting to small things, ordinary plans, the future not as a threat, but as an open question. Later, Michael walked Bear through the neighborhood, the air warmer now, the snow retreating into memory. He noticed people again, not as potential dangers, but as lives intersecting briefly with his own. He thought of Emily, of how one quiet decision had rippled outward, altering paths without fanfare. He thought of Sarah, of how understanding arrived not through argument but through evidence and time. When he returned home, he stood at the door for a moment before going inside, feeling the strange peace that came from knowing he would still wake some nights, with his heart racing, but would no longer wake, believing he was alone in carrying it. Michael Turner had never wanted to be a hero. The word felt loud and performative, like something meant for other people. He had only ever wanted to do the next right thing and live with the consequences honestly. As the evening settled and the city moved on, Michael understood that this, quietly and without recognition, was enough. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through an ordinary person who chooses to step forward when it would be easier to stay silent. Perhaps that is how God still works in our everyday lives, not by removing darkness all at once, but by placing courage in human hearts at the exact moment it is needed. In a world we walk through every day, parking lots, diners, streets, workplaces, we are constantly given small choices, to look away or to protect, to stay silent or to speak. Those choices may feel small, but in God's hands, they can become the difference between fear and safety, between despair and hope. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder that you are not invisible and that your actions, no matter how quiet, matter. Share this story with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what this story made you feel. And if you believe in stories of courage, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so these stories can reach more hearts. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you in your daily life. May He give you strength when you are afraid, wisdom when you are uncertain, and peace when the world feels heavy. You are not alone, and you never were.